Hi, my name's Dave Rafuse. I'm your host of BlendedTV, and I'm really excited to be bringing back the first episode of essentially season 2 of BlendedTV. We of course have Mel as our guest tonight. We're going to talk about a very different topic, however, something that is pressing in our world, systemic racism, and one of the really cool things that we have the opportunity of talking about tonight is actually surrounding Mel's new venture, which is Mel Clarke Consulting. Mel goes along to businesses and helps teach systemic racism and educate.
I teach about systemic racism. I'm not teaching you how to be, or I teach about systemic racism. Yeah.
We are going to dig into that tonight, and that's where I actually want to start. So we're going to dig into your position here as our heart director, chief heart
officer. And it's fair that you don't know the name because I made it up myself. Yeah, Jason recommended that. He told me a story where he'd heard about someone with this position, and we just both were like, yeah, that sounds about right for me here. Yeah.
And it actually goes along with what you're now doing with Mel Clarke Consulting. So how did this begin? And I want to hear, like, take us back. I know the story, but for those who are watching, don't. I mean, your experience right back to, obviously, your growing up, but like your education, everything kind of collides with what you're now doing. So please share.
So, I mean, I think I've had an interest in race and race relations my whole life. So because I'm biracial, my mom is white and my dad is black. And so when you're born into an environment like that, from the time you're born, you understand that your mom or one parent has different experiences in the world than another parent. And it's really clear to you as a child that you see that, or that you are a result, or you exist in this world and people do not approve of your existence alone, like just you existing in this world. And I was aware of that. So I had family members that never engaged with me because I was a product of a black man being with a white woman. So right from the time I was a child, this was something that was clear and in my face, and I wanted to learn more about it, and I wanted to know why things were the way that they were.
Was there a point as you were growing up where you at what point did you realize that your childhood was different than a lot of those that were around you in PEI?
When I moved to PEI, I was 6 years old, and I started to go to elementary school, and that's when I noticed, kids are so honest, and so kids are hilarious and honest, and they can be really mean, and kids just ask me questions like, why do you look like that? Why are you that color? Like, what happened to you?
How did you answer that at 6 years old?
Well, for me, I was like, nothing's wrong with me. This is just how I was born. I didn't understand why they didn't understand. So I would go home and I would tell my parents, and my parents would go to the school and they would say, hey, this is happening with our child, so this might be something that the school wants to address so that kids are more aware. And, in some instances that the teachers would be like, doesn't happen in my school, and just total denial. And my mom, in that case, when I was in grade 2, asked me to be moved into a different class, and the teacher in the other class was like, yep, this is an issue. And I remember them, when I was in grade 2, bringing my dad in to speak to the kids. And most kids had never seen a black guy ever. And so my dad talked about who he is and where he's from, and he's from Barbados, and in Barbados, everybody looks like him, and the kids would be a minority there, and just gave them some context to who we are. So that I found really helped, but I still experienced, kids just being mean. And it was, if you have any sort of physical attribution that makes you look different, kids are gonna call it out if they want you to feel bad. And so they did. But It wasn't until I moved to Halifax, so I knew deep down. So I did experience some things, like I mentioned in a session with Blended and the staff that, you know, my mom would take me to the hairdressers and they would just touch my hair and be like, sorry, I don't know what to do with this. And like that would hurt me. And so I mean, I did grow up like every young girl grows up, wishing I had long straight hair, wishing that I looked like other girls, because like PEI, I had no black women in my immediate life. So I didn't know that this was beautiful or that it could be. And there was no BET in PEI at the time, Black Entertainment or Television. So I didn't have access to Black culture in any way, even on television. My only experience with Black people was in the news, and in the 80s and 90s, it was never good, never positive. So that made me yearn for my own culture and to see it in a positive light. When Oprah came around, I was obsessed. Like Oprah was my godmother in my mind, and she became my beacon. I want to be Oprah, I want to be like Oprah. This is a woman who is Black and is loved, and that is a possibility. So even if she's overweight or, fluctuates with her weight, and like people still love her and they want to be around her. And so she became kind of my beacon. So I knew that when I reached 18, I wanted to leave the island because I wanted to be immersed in Black culture. And so I came to Halifax. And when I came to Halifax, I was like, where are all the Black people? I don't see any of them. And then it dawned on me that Halifax is a very segregated city with a very, very tumultuous history when it comes to Black and white relations. And that's when I felt this sadness and a lack of awareness that like I didn't know this was the case and I should have known, and why is it the case? And so I was enrolled in science and I quit. I dropped out of sciences and I like halfway through my first year, and I started studying history and political science with a focus on colonial history and American foreign policy. So colonial history in a history class to study what happened here in North America, and then American foreign policy in my political science class to understand what happened with colonial history in Africa and Latin America. And I did that because I just needed to understand. I had no idea what I was gonna do with. My dad was like, what kind of job are you gonna get? And I was like, I don't know, and like, I'm 37 now and I'm finally using that information, but I found like, I didn't care. I just wanted to understand, and I felt that if I had a better understanding of the world, I would I would be more understanding of people as well. So not just what Black people are going through here, but also why white people don't know why there are no Black people in downtown Halifax. I needed to understand that. And so that's why I started studying it. So that was my first real foray into like looking into racism, into looking into the history and the why. When I came out of university, I went to Black Business Initiative, which is an organization here that they provide financial loans to Black-owned businesses and also business awareness and business courses. And to me, that was like the culture I was looking for. I worked in an environment, everybody was Black. I mean, all different shades of the spectrum, but everybody was Black. There were Black Nova Scotians, there were people from the Caribbean, there were Africans that worked there, and I was just like, tell me everything. Like it was such a great experience for me.
So let's fast forward to today. Now you've created a consulting company. There's obviously a huge need for, education and learning. What's driving you? What changed you are you trying to make? Like what can you do to help executives, leaders within companies, and just overall our entire community here in Halifax?
So I mean, like I always have to say that I do not speak on behalf of all Black people, right? And that's like you don't speak on behalf of all white males. I don't speak on behalf of all Black people. So, and I've spoken to a lot of different people who are doing this kind of work, and everybody has a different reason for why they're doing it. Me personally, I am a grassroots person. I believe in grassroots movements, and I study political science, and those are some terms that are popping out, but I am not going to wait on policy from a government to make changes in society. because I just don't think that the government has the power to make changes in society. I think that they can create policy, and I think that the next government can be voted in and they can alter that policy, or they can limit funding in a certain area, and that policy just suddenly doesn't become as important. And, you know, so I'm not going to wait on policy changes to create change. For me, basically my motto in this is that there's no conversation too small. I think that the more conversations I can have with people that allows them to understand the system of racism that we live in, that we exist in, that we all partake in different ways, if I can help people to understand that, I think I hope and I believe that I can change some perspectives, or I can at least allow people to take a step back and be like, where do I exist in this system? How have I contributed to it? And now how can I break it down? So that's my goal, is to just create awareness. So if I talk to 5 people, and those 5 people go home and they talk to their family and they talk to their friends, and it creates conversation, and people are like, oh, I never thought about it that way, or now I have some better understanding, or you know what? I might call Mel and ask her some more. Like, that's what I'm looking for, because I spent 37 years on this earth and nobody wanted to talk about this stuff. So now that people are open to it, I'm jumping right in.
Yeah. Now, even though people are open to talking to it, it's still a really hard conversation
Always.
to bring up.
Yeah.
And it's an even harder conversation to have when you have friends that aren't educated with it, and myself included. I mean, we've had a lot of conversations over the last couple of months about it, and you know,
we've had conversations years.
True.
Yeah, it's been years. Yeah.
But how do we, so like specifically in a corporate world, and that's the direction that I want to kind of take this, because you know, as leaders, executives, CEOs, how do we create change from the top down within corporations? Because I feel like that's a big part of what you're trying to and attempting to try to do.
Of course. So my take on that is this. First, you have to understand that systemic racism exists and that you are a part of it. And everywhere you look around you, like if you are on a board of directors, or if you are on a senior executive team and it is 90% white, then you are taking part in systemic racism, and that has led you there, and that has allowed this to happen. That's my first thing. I want people to understand that. And systemic racism means that, you know, if you have an injury, if like you have swelling in one knee, you're like, that's an issue with my knee. But if you have swelling in both knees, it's systemic. You know, it's a problem with your body that's happening. And like systemic racism is a problem with every institution that is out there. And so my thing is, I want to tell people in those corporations that you might not have created this system, but it's up to us to dismantle it. And just like systemic racism touches everything, so hiring practices, inclusion, how we interact with people in the office place, who's on your senior executive team, who's a janitor, everything from conversations to policies. Systemic racism is a part of all of those things. So if you have to take an approach of systemic anti-racism in order to undo that. So that means every decision that you make as an organization, you have to be aware of is this contributing to systemic racism, or is this dismantling it? And that comes to every decision that you make as an organization. You have to be thinking consciously about being inclusive. Is this diverse? Is this representative? And all of those things. So that's my major thing. And so what does that look like for each organization? It might look like hiring practices. It might look like understanding what kind of engagement people have within the organization. You might have, you know, your 90% of white staff very happy and engaged, but understanding that the cultural differences with your non-white staff, that engagement isn't working for them. That culture isn't working for them.
I think one thing that you brought up today in our staff training that I found interesting, because as someone who does a lot of the hiring at a company, I felt as though the direction that we were trying to go and making this change, which is a huge change to make. Like, this isn't a change that's expected to be made over the course of a year or the next 5 years. Like, this will take, as you said, years and years, 20, 30 plus years to kind of do. But even still, initiating this change, we're not expected to just fill holes. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I thought that was very interesting.
Like the token hires and things like that. Yeah. So, I mean, when it comes to hiring policies, so first of all, I look at diversity and inclusion. To really oversimplify it is two different things. So you could have diversity is just, we'll say it's the quantity, it's numbers. You can go through your organization and list of people and say, this is how many women we had, this is how many men, this is how many able-bodied people, disabled, orientation, and break it down. And you could have a very diverse organization. Doesn't mean anything, really. Diversity isn't the issue, it's the inclusion part of it. So what are those people doing? What positions do they hold? How are they engaging in the company? How do they feel working at this company? Can they be themselves? There's a term called code switching that's really popular with, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, where you have to be one way at work and then you're yourself everywhere else, right? So for instance, my dad is Bajan, he has a Bajan accent, nobody knows that because he doesn't use it at work, right? Because he wants to be treated like everybody else and respected like everybody else. So that's the inclusion part. So inclusion, I don't look at it as a numbers thing, I look at it as a quality thing. What is the quality of your organization? So when you're looking at hiring practices, you want to make sure that when you're investing in diversity, that you aren't just hiring for the sake of hiring someone that fits the numbers, right? We have 5 new Black hires. Great, that's great. How do they feel? What are their jobs? What's their experience within your organization? Are they providing? The word token is when you just hire someone because of their color, and it doesn't work for anybody because they're not happy. Because what makes people happy at work is when they feel valued, when they feel like they're being productive, when they're feeling like they're providing a service that organization really needs. And if you just hire someone for their color or for their diversity to fill the numbers, they're not going to have those feelings. So they're not going to be a proactive part of that organization. So you're not going to be happy with them either. And that just furthers.
So you think you're doing something right, but really you're doing damage.
Exactly. It's damage to both of you, because then you're like, I hired 5 Black people and none of them worked.
I think this is why bringing you into a conversation especially at an executive level in companies is such a valuable conversation to be having right now, because we all want to, I think I can say for a lot of business owners that I know, that we want to be a part of making change. We just don't know how to do it. So how, if you were to kind of list off, let's start with 3. So I guess that's huge. Let's go 3 now. Let's 1 or 2 ways that as executives we can dismantle systemic racism within our companies. Is that a fair question to ask? How would you start?
So, I mean, this is different for every person that works in this kind of field. I take a different approach because those policies and procedures are great, but who cares if the CEO doesn't understand that what they're saying is racist or a microaggression? So again, it comes down to the culture. If you have culture and engaged people, it doesn't matter what their background is, they're going to be a productive worker, right? But you have to work on that culture first. So I always start with training. I like the workshops because I like letting people know that, okay, we're gonna talk about this. I'm gonna tell you that you're a part of a racist institution, not that you created it, that we exist in it. And I'm gonna get you uncomfortable because it's always going to be uncomfortable. And I want you to get there so that when it happens in your organization, you are ready to deal with it. Right? So even if you have policies in place, and even if you have a diverse culture, and what happens when someone says that's racist? Because if people aren't prepared to talk about and acknowledge that racism, who cares?
So this happens in a couple different ways though. So like on that note, how do you address that when you're kind of in an environment where racism's happening?
So how do you address
Family,
when
friends,
you see it?
like, yeah, when
Right.
do you do that?
So again, I feel like this is a very East Coast based approach because this is where I'm from, and I don't, I always say, like, how do you deal with being called out, or how do you call someone out? Is that which one?
Both. I mean, I would say more so like, how do you call someone out? So if I'm out with a bunch of friends and a scenario happens, how do I address that in a way that's appropriate?
Well, I think it's just, if you ask more questions, asking questions allows people to stop and think about what they've said, because a lot of time, if it's an outright racist thing, like that person's an N-word, or I don't actually like being served by black people, or a racist term for any BIPOC person, I would expect you to say, like, I don't ever want to hear that language in my presence, right? Like that's a deal breaker for me, I love you, but that is racist, and it is not okay, and I will not put up with it. But if it's a microaggression and like that person, so when a microaggression happens, I always talk about intent versus impact. So the intent might not be to be racist or to hurt someone, but the impact is. So those are a lot harder to deal with and call out because people aren't trying to be racist or engage in racist behavior. It's just happening and they're not aware of it. So those are the more difficult conversations to have. So again, asking like, why do you think that? Or what brought you to that conclusion? Or, still, I'm not comfortable with what you just said, and here's why. Those kinds of things. I don't ever like to say, hey, you're racist, because I think we all can engage in racist behavior. And it's not binary, being racist. It's not like you're racist, and that's kind of where we've come to in society, which is why it's been so hard to talk about, because, being racist is being associated with the Ku Klux Klan or lynchings or really, really terrible things that happen in society. So if you're racist, you must be a bad person. And if you're not racist, you must be a good person. But there's a gray area in there where like a lot of good people with good intentions engage in racist behavior. So to just tell them that they're not a good person or that they are a racist, that is going to get their back up. And I'm not trying to be an apologist for that person, but my approach is always like, let's get to a place of understanding here. What was your intent with that comment? And let me then talk to you about the impact of it.
I think a lot of it is education as well. A few that you brought up today in our training session, terms such as tribe and spirit animal, like they're words that I had never really associated with racism and really fully understood the impact of them. Yeah. So exactly to your point.
Yeah, so those fall under the terms of like cultural appropriation, which is, one of the hardest things to kind of call out, because not every black person thinks it's a bad thing when a white woman puts braids in her hair, but some people do, and they might have reasons for that. Maybe they got kicked out of their school because they had braids, or they weren't hired because they had braids, and when a white person has braids, they're okay to do that. So understanding that experience leads to why people react a certain way to that cultural appropriation is really important. I mean, that's why I studied colonial history, so that I would know, I wanted to know people's history so I understood where they are now, right? Because that's the only way you can do it, is understanding their history. So there's a lot of history and connotations, negative connotations with a lot of terms that we use nowadays that, in the internet and Instagram, that it just needs to happen once, and then all of a sudden it's a trend and it's happening and everyone's saying it. And you're not cool if you're not saying savage, but do you understand the connotations, the historical connotations that come with that word, the genocide that was created by using that word? Or do you know what I mean? And again, not everybody finds it offensive, but it's important for you to understand the history of it.
I would never have connected the two. And it just comes back to education.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's where it's like, how do you react to being called out? So that's also really important. So you could say these words a million times in front of 5 people and nobody has a problem with it. But that one time that one person does, it's not okay for you to be like, well, these 5 people are cool with it. You have to listen. It's important to listen. When you offend someone, when you cross the line from a racial perspective, try to listen. Like, that's the most important thing. If you want to understand this world and you want to understand why we are and why we interact the way that we do, try listening. Yeah.
Let's go really quick because we're going to wrap this kind of up in about 5 minutes here. Going back to corporations, specifically around hiring. So when you're looking at creating policies at a corporate level on like what's the approach? Because it's not just filling a gap, right? So going back to that tokenism.
It is really important to be like, to hire at all levels with diversity, not just the lower levels in your organization. So, I mean, if you're gonna have a hiring policy where you're like, I am going to interview every person of color that applies to this job because we don't have representation of people of color in this organization. So, resumes don't always show you who your best candidate is.
And it is 2020. I mean, we ultimately look at social media, LinkedIn, basically for anything.
It's true, right? And so, and that's just reversing the thing. Like, I worked in a recruitment company in the UK where for specific clients, they were like, it was literally like, if there was an Indian name, I don't want it to come across my desk, right? So you are only as diverse and inclusive as your hiring practices. You can say, we're going to interview every person of color that comes across, because again, taking into account that, every privileges and privilege that you have in society, like not everyone is going to have the same access to creating a resume, to computers, to all of those things, right? So that really opens things up. Yeah, there's all kinds of things you can do. And then when you're looking at your organization, I would say if you're going to do that, you need to do it at all levels. So like looking at your executive and your senior team and saying like, I still want to see more people of color when I'm hiring for my senior team, because they're out there and they're capable, and it's important for representation purposes that people see them at a high level, because those are the people making the decisions, creating the culture of your organization, and you want that lens if you want to be an inclusive organization. And then you can look at other things like, how do I create a track that for growth for people of color or BIPOC people in my organization? So if I do have people of color or BIPOC people and they tend to be at this level, what kind of training, what kind of track, fast track, or can I help with to allow them to grow in this company in a way that's inclusive?
Amazing. Yeah. Mel, thank you so much. Reintroducing BlendedTV back, and more than anything, I think what our viewers can kind of take away is that there is a lot of education that needs to happen, and that is your new role. Yeah, so like they can reach out to you. We'll get your contact information into this whole somewhere in here. Riker will put it all up there, and yeah. But people can get a hold of you through LinkedIn.
This is me and my awareness of technology. Yeah. Do your little do. Yeah.
But yeah, they can get a hold of you, bring you in, start that education process. It's very, very important.
And it's always based on, I understand that, my experience is like a startup in the fitness industry, and then, when you're talking to a law firm or a larger organization, those things are going to change and they're going to be different. So it is based around your organization and what you want, where you want to go in that organization. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in, guys. We will be back with another episode over the next month or so. Comment below, ask questions. Mel will follow along with the posts and answer any questions, or if you do indeed want to chat with her, reach out. Thanks for tuning in.